Weirdly, I can't play a video and have it record, so we're going to finish out some of this. We're going to talk about this idea of cyber terrorism, which I think is kind of the most frightening. Certainly, if they get a hold of your bank account, that's bad. But if we disable infrastructure or we cause loss of life, if we can take over the train control system and we have two trains collide head on that are carrying hazardous chemicals and thousands of people die, that's a little more impactful, I think. So one of the takeaways is that it doesn't usually start in the main system. So usually where these kinds of things start is some kind of system off on the side that nobody's protecting. A couple of years ago, the biggest breach we had in history was that of Target. Target's breach came through the thermometer and their HVAC controls. That's how they got into the system to start with. So we have to be careful about not just our main systems, but everything we do. So yes, that HR system's important. Yes, our email's important. So there is a service called CERT, and you can actually go onto their website and report incidents so that the federal government has an idea what's going on. So we know that every day there are people trying to log into some of these systems, trying to find their way into the controls at a nuclear power plant or a regular power plant or the railroad or water treatment plants. It happens every day. And we know that they're doing it. So part of our response has been writing laws that address some of these crimes. Now, it's a little hard to deal with because are these people necessarily in the United States? No. But the FBI especially has been very vigilant about trying to grab some outside of the United States. So there's a lot of different laws that are out there. The Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. So some of these now have got some teeth on it. The Computer Fraud Act. Some states now have gotten very aggressive, California in particular, about privacy and some security laws. So there are some harsh realities. And sometimes these guys that do these attacks are brazen enough that they'll fly to the United States for some reason and they will get caught. And some of them have been caught here recently. And that's good that we're catching some of these. But when they're state actors, it's a little harder to get them. If it's the Chinese government or the Korean government, it's a little harder to find those. So what do we need to do? And this is where it gets a little more complicated. We really need some kind of a program or an agenda or a diagram of our actions of what we're going to do. So if something happens, we're working at a company, they get compromised, we need to have it pre-planned on what we're going to do. Who do we have to notify? What do we do? Do we just let it continue on for months like Target did? I hope not. But we also have to do things like worry about how do we protect that evidence so that hopefully the actors can be charged. So we need a whole list of activities that are going to happen. How do we contain it? How do we get it back off our system? And how do we recover and go back to normal operations? So some of this is that boring, horrible, oh my goodness, we have to do paperwork. But kind of the first step is we need to think about a risk assessment. What are our things that are at risk in our company, for ourselves, for whatever organization we're at? So certainly the risks for Peru State College are different than what they are for you as a person. So how do I try to identify those? So identify what might happen, identify what the potential for that is. What could happen? What's the impact? So if somebody gets into my PSC, could they shut the college down? It's very possible because a lot of things rely on that. It would certainly be an impact to attendance. We would have to deal with all those student records. What is it going to cost us to mitigate that? So the average cyber attack now in the U.S. costs a company $1.3 million. Would that hurt Peru? Yeah, we have a $15 million budget for the year. That's going to hurt. So we need to look at all these steps. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? So here is a typical risk assessment. So we have what's going to happen or what is threatened, how often it could happen, the likelihood it will succeed, and what that cost is. And then we use a little mathematical formula so we get an estimated cost. So in other words, what that would cost us per year. And then we rank them. There are things that will not happen. So if I think about risks and physical risks, is a hurricane going to impact Peru? No. So it would be very low. On the other hand, does localized flooding impact Peru? Yeah. So it's much more likely. We know that it's happened really 3 out of the last 5 years. So we would go through and create a list like this. So it's not necessarily just cyber attacks we'd put in this list. We'd also list other events that could occur. Fire, floods, tornadoes, all those kinds of things in our risk assessment. And we're going to write responses to those. Those responses are kind of that idea of a security policy. So the policy is that overarching, those documents that guide our business, that list of this is what we need to do, these are the items that we need to perform. But the worst thing in all of this, or the best thing, depends on how you look at a company, is people. People are the cause of about half of all the cyber events because they do things like, hey, somebody called me on the phone, they said they're from IT and they needed my password. Well, here you go. Here's my password. So we need to train users much better than we do. We need to train people. Why do we not let you give your password away? And it happens all too often. Somebody goes, man, I forgot my password, but I got to get in here today. Oh, here, use mine. Or you find passwords stuck on monitors or under a keyboard. Or they set up a password where it's password 123, and then when the 3-month timer expires and it has to change, they all go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And everybody in the office knows everybody else's passwords. That's not safe. So we need access controls. Who can access information? Not necessarily just because we don't want everybody to see it, but if you have access to it, you likely can delete it accidentally also. And the ability to accidentally delete files happens every day in companies. They go, oh man, Bill was playing on the computer and accidentally deleted all of our accounting files. We also need to look at unusual behavior. If you start getting a bunch of spam emails that seem very targeted to your organization, talk to whoever's your security group. If it's a larger company, you'll have an IT security people. If it's not, you probably need to go to your boss, your manager, and hopefully they understand the impact of some of these things that are happening. One of the worst ways we lose data is people lose their laptops or portable devices or their tablets. And if you've constructed a data system where they can take that data home with them, that's horrible. We lose thousands and thousands of laptops and devices every year. They're stolen out of airports. They're lost in luggage. You just left it on top of your car and drove over it. How do I make sure that data is all safe? And it sometimes isn't. The best case of losing data was a contract worker for the VA, Veterans Administration, lost a laptop, had the records for 26 million VA patients. Oops. And we know that medical data is pretty critical. Here we just lost 26 million records out of it. They don't know where they left it. So we can write things and do things, but we have to worry about people every minute of every day. And we all know people that are not safe. That's just a common fact. We know people that if you had a list and you said, don't click on this item, what would they do? Hey, let's click here. We also know that there are people, we call them retraining people, that every day they go to work, it's a retraining day. You've met these people, right? We have to be able to deal with them. So one of the things you can do is do testing and training with your employees. So these are just some questions in here that you could ask yourself. So, do I have the most current version of your operating system? In other words, is it fully updated to all the security updates? If you've got an iPhone or an Android, do you have the locate my device or find my phone enabled so you can find your phone? We actually had a couple years ago, one of our freshmen comes running into my office and says, my phone's been stolen. Had a class down in TJ Majors in 114. And his phone got, let's call it unauthorized borrowed. He had a Find My Phone feature turned on. He didn't actually have some other things going, but he turned it on and we found his phone for him. It magically had wandered its way over to the library, and we set off the alarm and it started ringing, 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 ringing. They found it laying on a table over in the library. Now, there were a lot of other things he did which were dumb. He left it laying there on a desk, unattended. He didn't have a PIN code protection, so they had actually called out on his phone already and used his phone to make some phone calls. So it was pretty quickly apparent who did it. But there's a lot of other things we don't think about. How many of you, when you go somewhere, look for the Wi-Fi connection and just log on to a Wi-Fi? Yeah. Is that safe? Oh. I'm going to say if you're in a public place and using their Wi-Fi, if you send data that you think might be important, it's already been lost. If you go to the airport and you're sending banking information, I'm going to put you in the, hey, I don't really want you in my brightest category list. Because we know that those get hacked all the time. And there's things like man-in-the-middle attacks that we can do. So, free public wireless is a security threat. Are there ways around it? Yes. And a lot of companies require you to VPN or use something called a tunneling software or a virtual private network to come back to their own network. So there's ways to make it better. What about clicking on emails? Oh man, there's a link in this email. I'm just going to click on it and see what happens. Well, now we get them in text mails or text. I got one just the other day that told me I had won a new computer at Amazon if I just clicked here. And we see those a lot. They're moving targets trying to figure out where you're at. So one of those things, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Nobody is going to give you $25 million if you contact them because you're a long-lost relative. That's probably not going to happen. So, what about backing up our files? Is the stuff we need backed up some way? And if all you're backing it up to is a flash drive, I'm going to tell you that that is going to be a problem. Those flash drives aren't very reliable. They're easy to lose. So now I've lost my flash drive that's also got all the data I need for my company. Oh no, what do I do? And they're easy to have other things happen. So a couple years ago, I went to use the restroom. And I have a flash drive, and they come with the little lanyard around your neck, and it had everything for the entire semester on that flash drive. And it's on my neck on this little lanyard, and I just left class, and I'd thrown it back on there. In the men's stalls, we had these urinals, but they were busy, so I went in and was going to use the regular toilet. And as I reached down to flip open the lid for the toilet, guess what falls off my neck? There's my flash drive in the toilet. So that data's gone for a lot of reasons. So I like to think that year I had a crappy backup plan. Okay, that's where you groan and go, oh, that's a bad joke. So there's things that can happen. We need to make sure that data is secured. So things like using the SkyDrive that you have now with Microsoft Office. Or your Google Mail, you can store things there off-site. That gives you a better backup than if it's just stored locally on your computer. What happens if somebody steals your laptop and you don't have a copy of that stuff? Great. So, things like social media. Does anybody post a lot of content on social media sites? It's frightening sometimes how quick that spreads. So I have a 9 and 10-year-old. My 10-year-old started posting videos on TikTok against my wishes, but it was at mom's house, so I can't control that. She posted some TikTok videos, shaking her butt. She's 10 years old. I looked at one. There were 1,700 people had liked that video of a 10-year-old shaking her butt. Now, 40 or 50 of those are probably grade school kids that she knows. What are the other 1,000, 1,500 people in there? And so we had to have lessons about that social media and try to get her to understand that not everybody on there is who they say they are. And we know that's very common. But there are people that don't get those lessons yet. Posting all those quizzes that you see on Facebook. Have you noticed that the questions they ask are very similar to those two-party authentication questions you'll see if you go to your bank? It says, hey, what's your mother's name? Hey, where were you born? And all those kinds of questions. You are able to compile a lot of information by doing social media research. Well, it's not just the cyber attackers looking at that social media. When you go apply for a job, guess what the first thing they start searching for? There are actually companies that you can give them your name, and all what they will do is run a social media profile and give it to your future potential employer. We've had people here at this college that have lost potential jobs and or fired from jobs because of social media postings. They come back to haunt you, unfortunately. So some of them are kind of silly. There was a teacher education student that lost a job at a private school because she posted pictures of herself with a beer and in a bikini out on a river or lake. But it's in their contract that that's one of the things that they don't encourage. So we need to be careful of that. What do you do on Facebook? What do you do on other social media sites? So be careful, because those things can come back to haunt you years and years and years later. Anything we do out on the web, it doesn't go away, unfortunately. And so you made a smart comment 10 years from now, it could come back and haunt you. So one of the things we talk about is layers. Multiple layers of protection. So we protect individual computers, we put in firewalls, so that if one layer gets broken, there's hopefully another layer to at least slow them down, and we see that one layer gets broken into. The problem is, we know that that's not always as effective as we'd like it to be. Layers is better than nothing, but when they're in there for 6 months to a year, at a minimum, you need a firewall. And we're looking at a firewall, we're looking at a system. You're not talking $20 at Best Buy. You're talking probably $1,000 or more, depending on the size of your company. And that device needs to be able to be updated. So you need that subscription with it. So whatever company, if you go to Watchdog or several other different companies that make them, that firewall gets updated automatically and gets those rules updated every hour or half an hour or at least daily. Because there's a lot of threats out there. So the next level, they call them next-gen firewalls. They not only look at where traffic's going, where it's coming from, but they actually inspect the traffic inside of there. So they take a lot more processing power. These are a lot more expensive. You're talking thousands of dollars for something like this, but it protects your company, or tries to protect your company. We also use it for things like here on campus. If you tried to use a bit torrenting service and try to steal movies or borrow movies, it's going to block that because it looks inside that traffic to see what's going on. So we also call those a packet shaper. So sometimes we do things like a dashboard, and we look at, are these targets met? So we'll go through and look at what are kinds of things we need to do. Do we have separation of duties? In other words, one person doesn't handle all of the payroll and all of the accounting and billing and software, because that removes some of that chances for fraud. So this is just a quick way. In this case, they failed a couple of these items. So they said percentage of agents, employees trained on information security. They wanted 100. They only have 90 trained. So it's not just the people training. It's the policies are also included in here. The actual number of violations, those things that have happened, we look at and try to come up with a better solution. The common myth is, man, all I got to do is buy from Norton the antivirus software and I'm good. Or I buy McAfee or whatever brand is out there. So, do I need antivirus software? Absolutely. Is it foolproof? Absolutely not. So, things that I can find. Well, I know that antivirus company is always behind whoever's writing the viruses. That's just the way it is. They have to write the virus before we can find the virus. Now, there's some new technologies they're using. A lot of times you'll see the term sandboxing. So when you install a new program, it runs in what's called a sandbox, like a virtual environment first, to see if there's anything suspicious about it. So they're getting better. They're trying to be proactive. But antivirus software is a must. It's not foolproof. If that's all you're depending on, you're going to be sadly mistaken at some point. So it has to be updated. If you're at a corporation and with multiple computers, you probably need some kind of central control so that if a computer gets compromised according to the software, it gets reported to somebody. It doesn't just sit there and somebody just go, oh, there's a box on my computer, let's click. So we have some kind of centralized control. There's a couple of other things. And you would think that this makes sense, and why would anybody ever forget to do this? But if somebody leaves a corporation, they get fired, they quit, whatever, get rid of their accounts. Close them down as quick as possible. But you would be amazed how many companies I've walked into, and they have dead or no longer their employees all over their systems. They still have access to emails. They still have access to internal systems. Great. So you need that policy from human resources that, hey, as soon as an employee leaves, they send us an email, and we cancel their email and login credentials that minute. Not when we get to it or in a couple weeks, immediately. But I've even seen that here. I know of former students who had email access for years after they graduated because they didn't purge those very often. Well, if they're not doing that for students, are they doing that for faculty that leave? Probably not. So, you need to make sure that we deal with human resources and make sure that people, when they're gone, they're gone. Now, there are some funny stories, though, of people getting fired via email. They closed their email, so they never got the email that said they were fired. So they showed up at their desk. I'm going to say, if you're firing somebody, don't fire them via email. That seems like a cold, heartless way to get rid of somebody. So, we know companies are bad about responding. It's not our core business in most cases. If I'm out here and I'm running an organization that's got a bunch of grain mills, or we're producing corn as a farm operation, IT security isn't where I spend a lot of time. So my computer system could be very vulnerable. So US CERT is a great place to look for resources. Make sure your computer systems are up to date and your applications. Keep an eye on things that seem weird, seem unusual. We know it's hard to keep up with everything. There are so many vulnerabilities out there. So, one of the ways companies can try to address this is with a security audit. So, typically, we actually hire somebody outside of our company. So, those organizations that perform these, they know best practices, and they're looking at things with that fresh, unbiased eye. They're looking to see what is actually going on in your company. So they'll test things like your antivirus, your firewalls. They'll look at your policies. The most intrusive model of this is where they're performing something called a penetration test. So a penetration test says they're trying to get into your system. So they're acting as a hacker group or a hacker and trying to get in there. The next level of that up is they're actually doing physical penetration tests. They're trying to get into your organization. So they may try to walk in through a door. They may try social engineering to get past the secretaries up front. They may break in at night, lock picking a door. If I hire them at that level. Is this expensive to do? Well, it's not cheap, but it's a really good security measure. And having those outside reviews gives us that idea of what's going on versus what we think we have. Because what we do is, hey, I have the best system in the world. I'm biased. I created it. My team created it. We think we're biased. We probably are. So there's some other things we can run in there. There's something called an IDS, or intrusion detection system. So what this does is it sets on our network, and it monitors what's going on our network and says, oh, I see something weird, and it looks for patterns. So there's a couple of different types. So behavior-based looks at how something behaves. Knowledge is based on existing attack patterns. So we know what typically hackers are looking for versus this seems odd and different than your normal activities. So intrusion detection system set in here. So this would be an example of one. That intrusion detection system setting off here on the side gets all of the traffic that goes in and out of the company. So it gets a copy of everything to look at and scan. When it determines that there's something odd or different, it should hopefully send an alert to that IT support and IT teams and saying, hey, we think there's an issue here. It's not perfect. But the best systems of this are pretty darn effective because they've already patterned themselves over what's happened at other organizations. So if that happens, we know we have a security incident. Somehow our data is leaving our company. We need to have a plan. So that plan may be, hey, we pull out the internet cable and we don't have internet for a week until we figure out what's going on. Pretty draconian, but some companies have that as their policy. We may have lists, if we're not an IT company or we don't have an IT support team on staff, you may have contracts with other companies. What are we going to do? What's the response? So part of that is we need to limit damage. Yeah, it's great if we could figure out who it is, but it's more important to limit that damage. Limit the damage and get your company back up and running as quick as possible. So some of that notifications. Who do we need to notify? What organizations, inside or outside? Do we need to contact major customers? So here at our college, if we had a cyber event, who are our major customers? You guys. So you would get letters saying, hey, we got hacked. Here's what we think happened. How do I deal with it? Do we need to contact external entities, local law enforcement, the FBI, state patrol? So it depends on what kind of incident it is. So if you find out that one of your employees has child porn on their company laptop, local police, state police are probably appropriate. If you've gotten hacked for $13 million, the FBI would probably be the most appropriate if it crosses those state lines. But we do have those ethical pieces. What do we tell our customers? Do you want to go to a college that you found out got hacked? They lost all your information? No. But I'll tell you that there are colleges that have had major breaches. We've had a breach a couple years ago. It was fairly minor, but it's something we needed to tell students about. But you would think an organization like Harvard, they got hacked. A lot of major colleges have been hacked over the years and had student data released. It's kind of an ugly thing. How do we tell our customers? If it's going to impact them, we should probably tell them. And that's one of the issues with things like our famous Target breach a couple years ago, is they weren't telling their customers that, hey, we've had a security breach and we think your credit card's compromised, but let's keep taking money in because we don't want to stop our Christmas sales. How do I ethically handle these situations? And remember, I always have to balance that with, I need my company to stay afloat, or my organization. So it's not always as easy as what we'd like to think. So, documentation afterwards, storing copies of all the emails, whatever it happens to be, whatever that evidence needs to be. We need to make sure that it's all preserved. Maybe it's not even for prosecution. Maybe it's just so that we know what to do in the future, and it goes to the FBI and they can create some lists of what we can do differently. Maybe our 13 million's gone, but other companies might be able to preserve some of their resources. So probably you'll need some legal advice on what you need to keep and what you don't. So that becomes an issue, especially in the case of things like our child porn case. We have an employee with child porn. Yikes. It's a horrible thing to think about, right? I will tell you, it happens more often than you would like to think. I had several years ago, we had a student who was actually my advisee in some of our classes that I just happened to notice in the local paper had been arrested on federal charges for child pornography. And so I raised the question to the dean. I said, well, he's coming to class. We have a daycare here. And his federal release actually states that he cannot use a computer anywhere except at the college. Yikes. So how do you deal with that? And we see those kinds of things. What if it's a financial crime? What kind of documents do we need to keep? Embezzlement is pretty common. We see embezzlement all the time, unfortunately. So we've got this plan. We said, all right, how do we shut down systems? How do we protect our data? Who makes these? And we generally want kind of a matrix of, well, if the owner isn't available, who can make those decisions? So we want to make sure that it does happen. It doesn't wait until we have somebody there. So before we wipe our system out and start over again, we talk about the idea of a forensic backup. So a forensic backup is that idea that it's backed up bit for bit on another drive. It's stored elsewhere and pulled off the system. So before I wipe stuff out, I got to make sure I have current backups. There are companies that have paid ransomware because they didn't have good backups. We need to make sure everything we do is documented. So we have kind of that chain of custody. And before we ever get to this point, hopefully we've decided we need backups. We need them frequently. Those backups are what can save us if we do have something like a ransomware attack. And they do happen around here all the time. So once we're done, so we've restored our systems, we've filed charges against the perpetrator, we've got our company back up and running, we need kind of a follow-up, a closing to this. So we write a report, essentially. And the report tells us what we know, what happened, the chronological listing of these events. How much did it cost us? Because we may be filing an insurance claim. Some companies will buy cyber insurance. We do at the college. Do we need to spend a lot of effort trying to catch this person or get money back out of them? So if it's somebody that's embezzled $150,000 from our company, we might want to try to get that money back from them. On the other hand, we may also find somebody that, if they just stole out of the cash register $20 and they were a minimum wage employee, are we ever getting our money back? Probably not. And then we have those decisions. Do we tell our customers what happened? Well, if we've told them that a security incident happened, we need to tell them the resolution and say, this is why we chose the actions we did. We preserved your data. We apologize for any inconvenience. Let's go back to the same way we were, right? So one of the things that a lot of companies do is they're not big enough to have their own IT security team. And so they will hire a vendor, a contractor, to do a security services for them. And so there's a lot of companies involved. There's hundreds of them out there that are doing that. So Dell, IBM, Symantec, Verizon, McAfee, Infogressive, there's hundreds. So these companies go in and they will add some software. They will make recommendations. So if you don't have a firewall, they're going to say, this is a firewall. We recommend this model. We'll implement it. So they generally price per computer you have behind their network. So they may charge you $20 a month per computer or whatever price they have. They're going to make recommendations about backups. So they may do web content filtering. They may do their own vulnerability scanning. They may do penetration tests. So you're hiring them to take over that security model for you. Well, there's some good points to this. That's what their specialty is they're working security. They're trying to be as proactive as possible. But I will say there's some disadvantages to this. Do you have local control anymore? No. And you're depending on somebody else. So hopefully you hire the right vendor. So before you just jump in bed with one particular company, look at their track record. Look at what they're offering. Compare them. But it's not a bad idea for a smaller company that doesn't have the resources to do this kind of action. So computer forensics is kind of a subfield of this. And it's kind of an interesting area. So what computer forensics experts do is they're trying to take law, they're trying to take these computer systems, and they're trying to figure out how do we merge the two of them so that we can find and deal with these computer crimes. So the FBI has forensic scientists. The State Patrol has computer scientists. Larger law enforcement offices. So Lincoln has some. Omaha. How do I get this data? How do I store it? So how do I properly handle it so it can go into court? One of the classes we've talked about doing, we haven't yet managed to pull it off, is to create one with the CJ people, to create one where we talk about it both from a legal side and from a computer side. And we look at that and create a couple classes where we do some mock drills and do some things. So at some point we will hopefully have one. So how do I properly preserve that data so it can make it to court? How do I look at things in a legal sense? How do I look at things in a forensic sense? So when we're looking at a company, you may run into a lot of different questions. So these are some that you might come in if you hire somebody or if you're doing your own. So do we have a firewall? Is antivirus? Is it updated? Have we got rid of logins? Are employee responsibilities defined? Are we using proper password procedures? Do we force password changes? All those kinds of rules. Is there a policy for that? Do we have a backup process? Have we verified? So not only did we create it, but did we actually test it to make sure that it actually works? A backup that you don't actually test isn't very effective at all. And sometimes you can buy some things. You go, man, I'm going to buy this latest, greatest system I saw advertised. It's going to back up my entire company. So an organization I've done quite a bit of work with bought a backup solution. And they spent a lot of money, well over $250,000 for this backup solution. And so they hired me to do a vulnerability assessment, and so I did. And I asked this question. I said, have you taken those backups and tried to work off of them and use them? And this is the response I got. Well, we can't. What do you mean you can't? You bought this system. As it turns out, that system maybe works well, but you have no idea. Because they don't let you go in and look at your own data. If you have a security incident, they will then sell your data back to you, even though you've paid them to encrypt it and paid them to store it, and they don't really have a procedure for testing. So on a one-time use was going to be over $50,000 to get their own data back to test to see if it worked. At that point, they decided they needed a different backup system and threw away, at that point, about $270,000 worth of backup system because it wasn't effective. It wasn't working. It wasn't what they actually needed. So those are the kinds of things we look at. Do we have policies? Does senior management? Do we have employees trained? All those kinds of things we look at. Do we have plans for what if something happens? Do we look at eradication? Has it been reviewed by the legal team? Is it a legal strategy we have? So there's a lot of pieces to this security. It's a hot job area. In fact, right now, if you look online, the FBI is looking for cybersecurity analysts that will work as an agent out of Omaha. So not only would you get to carry a gun, you'd get to be a nerd at the same time. So kind of the best of both worlds. So there are a lot of jobs out there. If I looked correctly, the federal government alone wants about 800,000 people in IT security. It is a huge field. And it's not necessarily always just sitting in front of the computer. There's a lot of other aspects to it. So they're looking for accountants that have fraud investigation skills. So they're looking for all different kinds of people to protect their country and their companies. All right, so this week, so there is a new discussion board for week 13. So week 13, same as week 12, you have to create out of the book and out of the things we've talked about multiple choice questions. So 3 multiple choice questions and 2 essay questions for chapter 6, 7, and 8. So very similar. So this week we're going to get 6, 7, and 8. You can already guess next week if you wanted to work ahead about which chapters we're going to use, right? We only have a week and a half left. Isn't that weird, scary, frightening? So that is the discussion board for that. So the other thing you might want to start doing is looking at what other people have posted, because I'm going to pull a lot of the questions for the final are going to come directly from questions you guys have created. So this is kind of your all-in-one, I'm creating the final and creating a study guide all at once. If you look at week 13, so make sure you've listed your attendance in there. And then there is an assignment we'll let you guys get started on in here today in class. So this assignment talks about Sony. Everybody likes Sony and PlayStations, right? Well, Sony also has motion pictures and several other things. And so this is a really famous case. So there's a couple of questions at the end to make sure that you are thinking and putting some effort in here. So, but Sony, it's a great corporation. It's a great story. And it's also should frighten you a lot. All right, any questions right offhand? All right.